Welcome. I'm Aline Fader, the Zoning Project Coordinator for the National Zoning Atlas, and today we're going to cover overlay districts and what zoning analysts need to know about them. We're going to answer the following questions in this video. What's an overlay? How do I identify them? And how do I enter data about them in the online editor tool? First, what's an overlay district? An overlay district is a zoning district that is layered on top of portions of other districts and provides certain distinct regulatory characteristics that alter or supplement but don't entirely override the regulations of the underlying districts. There are many reasons that jurisdictions use overlays. Jurisdictions might be subject to state or federal regulations, and to ensure compliance with those regulations, they'll implement them in their zoning. These include regulations around environmentally sensitive lands, like wetlands. Overlays related to sensitive lands may be established to meet Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, or state regulations. The FAA controls airspace around airports, and there may be zoning districts in your jurisdiction that require or set height limits, restrict development, or apply noise attenuation requirements for certain uses near airports. FEMA has flood insurance related regulations that are implemented through zoning a lot of times. And you may see floodplain or floodway zones that are in accordance with those regulations in order for properties in a given jurisdiction to be eligible for federal flood insurance. Local aquifers, natural areas, hillsides, slopes, and shorelines may also be protected through an overlay district. Usually these overlays will limit development within that area or add higher environmental standards for development. There are also overlay districts that seek to preserve or incentivize a particular type of built form. Some of the overlays that do this include historic districts that strive to preserve historic structures, usually through additional design review procedures. There may be other districts that require architectural review to meet the certain aesthetic standards set by the community. There are also a variety of overlay districts that try to incentivize particular development goals that a community might have. These can be reflected through overlays that are associated with neighborhood plans, affordable housing, elderly housing, special downtown areas, or specific commercial or industrial uses. These overlays may offer additional zoning relief for particular types of development desired by a community. For example, removing parking requirements for dense development near transit or when affordable housing is built. Sometimes you'll find districts that are related to a very, very narrow band of use, such as wireless communication tower districts, adult use districts, or marijuana dispensary districts. These overlays limit these particular uses, often within larger non-residential or mixed-use areas. Planned residential developments may also be recorded in zoning as overlays. While this presentation will cover some of the aspects of entering PRD-related data, please watch our PRD video to ensure that you're accurately entering PRD-related data. How do I identify an overlay? Most overlays conveniently have the word overlay in the name of the district. It's very common for this to happen, but it's not always the case. So be sure to check whether or not a district is described as overriding only portions of an underlying zoning district. Here is an example of some language that is used to describe an overlay district. Notice some common terminology you might find, like underlying zoning. And note the word overlay appears in the name of this district. Of most important to us is the phrase that indicates the underlying zoning shall be superseded. This sentence is very clear in setting forward that the tourism overlay district only applies for certain types and aspects of development, and otherwise the underlying district regulations govern the sites. Therefore, we know that this tourism overlay district is definitely an overlay district. Sometimes the zoning text may be less clear. It can refer to underlying districts in different language, but look for words like base district, override, and supersede. So hopefully you will find clear answers. The other way to identify overlays is to look at the map. As the name implies, overlays overlap other districts, so they will have oftentimes a different type of symbology than your regular district. They might have hatching, like the various commercial districts shown here on this New York City zoning map. The gray shaded area in the upper left is another type of overlay, a special district in New York City. Overlays may be located on a separate map altogether from your base districts, and that map could be located within your zoning text, so always be sure to check the text itself for maps. As a general reminder, the term floating means nothing. So if you see the word floating or floating district, don't assume anything. It doesn't mean the district's mapped or unmapped, it doesn't mean it's an overlay or not, and it doesn't mean it's mixed use. Read the regulations to see what's actually allowed. How do I enter overlay data? As a reminder, you need to confirm that you have an overlay district first. The name is usually the giveaway, and you can see here a list of overlays from Las Vegas. Notice the broad range of issues they cover, from airport regulations, downtown and economic development, live, work, and historic and natural preservation. Once you've made the determination that a district is an overlay, enter yes into the overlay field as shown. Next, you will determine if it is mapped or not. Part of determining whether or not this district is an overlay district is looking at the zoning maps, so hopefully you've already established whether or not it is on a map. If it is mapped, enter yes in the district mapped field. Again, be careful to check appendices and the text itself to ensure that overlays are not located on a separate map from the main zoning districts. And if you have a boundary that is determined outside of zoning, you can mark it as unmapped. This happens often with floodplains, which might refer to the FEMA flood insurance rate maps or preliminary firms. Next, you're going to determine whether or not this overlay changes how the area it covers should appear on the public map. If it changes the main use category of the underlying district for that area that it covers, you're going to input the way the area should appear by making the correct entry in the type of district field. For example, if the land that an overlay covers should appear as primarily residential, mark it as such. If, however, the overlay covers multiple districts of different types and it doesn't affect the nature of those districts, then you're going to select Overlay Not Affecting Use option from the Type of District field. As an example, here we have an adult use overlay. In this case, the overlay allows adult uses in certain portions of commercial and mixed-use districts and does not affect whether or not residential housing is allowed. Because this overlay can be in a mixed-use or commercial area, and we do not want to say that the entire area that it covers is non-residential when some areas may be indeed mixed-use or vice versa, then we're going to identify this district as an overlay not affecting use in the type of zoning district field. This way, the type of zoning district that is reflected in the underlying districts will determine how the map appears in our atlas. Here's another example. In this case, we have a floodway district. This is a portion of a flood zone that has been determined to be too dangerous for structures to be built upon, and housing is not allowed to be constructed here. In this case, the overlay prohibits residential development where the underlying districts might have allowed it otherwise. And since this changes the nature of the type of uses allowed, it is marked as non-residential to clearly show on the map that any land within its boundaries are not allowed to have residential uses built upon it, whether or not those underlying districts are primarily residential or mixed with residential. Now you're going to follow a few steps to fill in the treatment fields for housing as is shown on the next slides, where the uses are expressly permitted or prohibited by the overlay district, or if the overlay causes the process to approve housing to change from the underlying district. Otherwise, treatment fields should be marked as overlay, or in the case of the ADU affordable housing or PRD treatment fields, not mentioned. If you have a non-residential overlay district, the regular non-residential instructions apply. Simply mark all the treatments as prohibited except for the ADU treatment, which would follow the next steps, if it applies. If an overlay allows housing, you are going to make sure that you log the treatment field as allowed conditional or public hearing as applicable if it changes the conditions from the underlying district. If it prohibits housing, you're going to log the treatment as prohibited. If the housing is not modified from the underlying district, you're going to mark it as overlay. As an example, in a high-risk flood zone, new housing development is prohibited. The type of district should be marked non-residential, and all of the applicable treatment fields will be marked prohibited. Here's another example. In an aquifer zone, one-family housing is allowed with a public hearing, and commercial uses where they're already permitted are subject to increased environmental control standards. The type of district here should be marked overlay not affecting use because this overlay affects both commercial and residential areas and does not bar residential uses. The one-family treatment field for this district should be marked public hearing because regardless of how one-family housing is permitted in the underlying districts, where it is within this aquifer zone, you are required to have a public hearing in order to build single-family homes. On the other housing treatment fields, you're going to mark them all prohibited because this aquifer zone only allows one-family housing where it is, regardless of what the underlying districts allow. So 2, 3, and 4 or more housing treatments are marked as prohibited. Because no mention is made of ADUs, affordable housing, or planned residential development, those treatment fields are left simply as not mentioned. In addition to those entries, you can also add a visible atlas note to show that the commercial performance standards apply within this overlay, whereas they wouldn't normally outside of it. Here we have another example. This one is a neighborhood commercial zone, which allows commercial activities like restaurants and corner stores in what would otherwise be a residential area with no changes to the residential development approval processes. The type of district here would be marked mixed with residential to reflect the change that happens from being primarily residential without the overlay to now being a mixed-use area with the overlay. The housing treatment fields should also all be marked as overlay because the process and the standards do not change with the application of this particular overlay. In summary, when you're handling the treatment entries for an overlay district, only add allowed conditional, public hearing, or prohibited where the overlay changes or overrides the treatments of all of the base districts. Otherwise, mark overlay or not mentioned in the treatment fields. If the overlay partially changes treatments, you can mark overlay in the treatment field and add a note to the visible atlas notes field. So what do you do when the housing characteristics are modified by an overlay district? Well, you're only going to enter data for those fields that are actually modified. So don't replicate all of the data from the underlying district in your overlay field. Only mark those fields that are changed. As an example, in the underlying district, one-family housing requires 2 parking spaces per unit. But an overlay is mapped on a portion of this district that reduces that number of parking spaces to 1 per unit. That's the only change that the overlay does. Mark 1 in the minimum required parking fields for that overlay district. Mark all the other fields as NA. This signals that there is only 1 field that is overridden within this area. Sometimes an overlay might remove regulations, make things more permissive. For example, an overlay might remove a height limit, remove a setback, or a parking requirement. In these cases, it's okay to add zeros to the editor. It's the only time we allow this. And this 0 indicates that there is 0 requirement, not that the maximum height is 0. So again, 0 just signals that the overlay is negating any underlying district regulations. Overlays that are designed to incentivize development might partially change treatments or add additional development options. For instance, you may, in an underlying district, be allowed to build two-family homes as a right, but there may be an option within the overlay that allows you to do two-family homes with a public hearing that would, for instance, allow more floor area or increased height. These different regulations can often be added through the overlay by the use of alternatives similarly to how we add alternatives to base districts or underlying districts. These alternatives are added in a similar format. And for the treatment fields, again, we pick the most common process, similar to how we treat alternatives within a base district. As an example, here we have an affordable housing overlay district. It is mapped on mixed use and residential areas, and the underlying districts allow 4 or more family housing to be built. Where this overlay is mapped, there is an optional special permit which allows a developer to build affordable housing with a public hearing with reduced parking requirements. So you go through the public hearing and you can have less parking requirements if you're building affordable housing. How would you enter the data into the system for this? Well, this district that's an overlay does not affect whether residential uses are allowed or not in the underlying districts, and it does not affect how the uses should appear on the map. Therefore, we're going to mark the district as a district that is an overlay not affecting use. We are not going to indicate that this is an affordable housing only district, since the regular housing can still be constructed utilizing the underlying district regulations. Sometimes you'll have districts that will require within their boundaries affordable housing. In this case, they're leaving it as an option. When we look at the treatment fields for this district, it's pretty straightforward. For 1 to 3 family treatments, we're going to mark them all as overlay. This affordable housing overlay does not affect them. So we just mark them as overlay and we don't have to fill in any of the fields under those treatments. For the 4 or more family treatment, we're going to mark it as overlay as well, but we're going to add a visible note that indicates that there is an additional option available via public hearing. Next, we're going to add a no to the affordable housing only field under 4 or more family treatment, and then we're going to fill in the affordable housing treatment field and subfields just as we would if it was a base district according to the how-to manual. Under the 4 or more family housing section, we're going to add an alternative entry for the relevant parking fields. In this case, it will be 1 per affordable. This signals that as an option, you can have a requirement that is different from the underlying regulations. As a general summary, here are some key things to keep in mind as you enter data about your overlays. As we learned, the zoning map and the district name are usually the key things that will determine whether or not your district is an overlay. The type of district field will often be entered as overlay not affecting use, unless that overlay district changes the nature of all the districts it overlays. We are only going to use allowed conditional, public hearing, or prohibited in treatment fields where the overlay changes or overrides those treatments for all of the base districts. Otherwise, if it only partially changes treatments, we'll simply add overlay to that treatment field and add a note to the visible Atlas Notes field. We're going to enter data for only those housing characteristic fields that are modified by the overlay district. We will never enter base district data into an overlay district entry. If an overlay removes regulations, feel free for this one instance to enter zeros in the editor. And be sure to use alternative notations when an overlay allows additional options, even though there may be only one option in the overlay itself. This reflects that there are options in addition to what is annotated in the base or underlying districts. Thank you. I hope this was helpful. And as always, if you have questions, please reach out. We hope that this helps to explain some of the most common questions we get about overlays. And if you want, please reach out to ask us more. Thank you.